Yesterday, and I know that you've all read it and studied it and underlined it.
I move to adjourn.
Okay. You're a tough group of folks. Afterwards, I don't want these to be monologues. Afterwards, those of you who are able and have interest, after worship, we are invited just to sit around. It's an informal conversation so that we can discern together. So the text that Lynn just read opens up with religious leaders confronting Jesus. That's what's happening there. They're demanding that Jesus kind of prove himself to them. Essentially, they're saying, look, bub, who are you to speak on behalf of Yahweh? I mean, these are the religious leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees. Who are you to speak on behalf of Yahweh? And who are you to dare to critique us as if we are not the proper leaders? Prove yourself. Show us a sign from heaven. Now, today, in our own families and amongst our friends, and certainly in the media and throughout public life, there's a similar kind of confrontation that is going on between us. We find that we don't understand our families and our friends. We don't understand what's happened to them. We hear them talk about Jesus, but it's not a Jesus that we particularly recognize. We hear phrases from the Bible, but it's as if it's coming from an entirely different reality. And we find ourselves tired of saying to others, yeah, I'm a Christian, but not that kind. And that kind is the muscular Jesus, the dominating, take charge and take power Jesus, the Jesus who just as soon kill his enemies, shame and shun the sinners, and judge and condemn all of those who don't quite live up to his standards. We're mystified by the interlocking, that's a better word, interlocking of Christian rhetoric, Christian purpose, and Christian symbols with the policies of the Republican Party. We're not mystified that they would have an influence. We're mystified that they're so in lockstep. And we simply don't know how to interpret what we're seeing and hearing, and we don't know how to communicate with folks that we thought we used to know, even in our families. This sermon is about that. But I want to begin with some history. Jesus was Jewish, faithfully Jewish. He embodied the Jewish aspiration to live in the divine image, the divine presence of Yahweh, a name that meant, I will be who I will be. And the core and the center of Jesus' message and ministry and mission was very Yahwist-like. The Spirit of Yahweh has empowered me to bring good news to the poor, sight to the blind, release to the captive, liberation for the oppressed, and to declare the favor, the year of God's favor, the Jubilee. Do for others what you would have them do for you. That was faithful Jewish thought and practice. But something just didn't click. The keepers of the institution, which would have affirmed all of that, the temple keepers in this context, they felt threatened by something about Jesus, about his spirituality. They worried about the movement that he was starting. They worried that the occupying force of Roman Empire would see the gathering of his followers as a disrupting power. And actually, as it turns out historically, throughout Christian history, the powers and the authorities of governing institutions have quite often felt threatened by Christian advocacy, this spirituality of Jesus, the advocacy for those who are left behind and left out of the benefits of society. Christianity, in other words, has always carried within it, despite all of our compromises and hypocrisies and our failures, it has always carried within it a revolutionary critique of hierarchy, of those on top, the pecking orders. Within Christianity, there has always been a flattening and an egalitarian ethic in the proclamation. The spirituality of Jesus, faithfully Jewish, has always drawn upon an uncontrollable, unseen power. No matter who the king is, there's always an unseen king above the throne. There is within Christianity a radical freedom from bending the knee of allegiance to earthly powers. There has always been in Jewish and Christian thought a little bit of anarchy. Now, the tension between anarchy and order, between loyalty and resistance, between individual conscience and tribal obedience, that has always distinguished the spiritualities of both Jewish and Christian thinking. It's something we have offered the world. Last week, I talked about the tension between the spirituality of Jesus versus the religion about Jesus. Are we trying to, when we gather, are we trying to emulate the faith of Jesus, or are we conforming to a doctrine about faith in Jesus? Now, from time to time, these tensions, these opposites, they come apart. A tension means they're still together. That's the important part of this. When you pull them apart, something new gets created. But from time to time, these tensions, these opposites do come apart, and they explode in schisms and conflict. The very first big battle, and we talked about it a couple weeks ago, was over how Gentiles would be welcomed into the Jewish family. The Jews have always felt that they were chosen by Yahweh to role model a Yahweh-like life to the nations. This wasn't about arrogance. It was about purpose. This is why we're Jews. We're the family of Yahweh. We're to represent Yahweh. And the Jews found themselves always a minority people, a persecuted people. They never had much political or military power. They couldn't rule from on high. But they did have certain patterns of life that could lead to peace and prosperity for everyone. The emphasis on Sabbath and Shalom and Jubilee, care for the poor, hospitality towards strangers, welcoming of immigrants, accountability to a God of compassion, a God who loved their enemies. Paul's Gentile threat was one that went right to the heart of Jewish identity. If Gentiles were allowed to identify as Yahweh's people and yet not live out those 600 plus directions of Torah, not undergo circumcision as a sign of covenant, not imitate Jewish customs and traditions, then the vision of Yahweh would be compromised, liberalized, pluralized, and lead to an anti-Yahweh way of life that would destroy the moral basis, the purpose, really, of the people. Paul was felt that he wanted to blur the distinctions that integrated Jew and Gentile, transforming both together into a third race. He called it Christ's body. That was the breaking point. That was too much, not just for the Jews of Jerusalem, that was too much for the Jewish Christians, for those pillars. And again, we talked about this a few weeks ago. John, Peter, James, others. It led to the tragic break that occurred within the very early times of Christian, Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians who were trying to form a third path. but the tension was too much. In the first 300 years or so of our church, of Christian life, there was really no kind of central, remember the hierarchy? There was no real central authority that laid down the law, so to speak. And so congregations were formed by an oral traditions. The storytelling of Hebrew Scripture and the tales of who Jesus was and what he taught. And there were many traveling evangelists and prophets and teachers and healers, and they would go from congregation to congregation, which means that the quality control was really hit and miss. I mean, you can imagine this. Matter of fact, you can see it actually in our own life. There were con artists that were in it just for the money. There were spectacle makers in it for the power. And there were sincere pontificators who were sincerely distorted in their teachings. You might think today of sincere Christians who believe that COVID was a myth and that climate change is a hoax. They are sincere in their belief. Without a centralization of authority, it was diversity without unity. And it is like today. I mean, Joel Osteen is harmless, right? I mean, he just wants to smile, make you feel good about your best life now. And by the way, keep sending those love offerings because his net worth is $60 million. And Benny Hinn is great entertainment. His miracle crusades, all they want to do is to heal you. God bless them. Nothing wrong with that, right? But his $60 million net worth, well, that is a miracle. Yeah, that is a critique. I'm not being snarky. I think these are con artists. Gradually, which doesn't mean they can't do some good. I mean, that's life, isn't it? Bad people can do good things. Gradually, the chaotic, anarchic, unaccountable energies of Christianity did centralize. And it centralized under a hierarchy of bishops that resulted in the creation of the office of the Pope, who was thought to be the vicar of Christ, which is basically a sacramental presence of Christ on earth. And a different form of corruption emerged. We had unity. We didn't have diversity. It's kind of like Frodo's ring. Centralized power always wants to bind all other power to its service. And it took about 1,000 years. But rebellion came in the form of a protesting movement against this monopoly of Catholic universalizing power. And it broke Christianity into many Christianities: Lutherans, Presbyterians, Mennonites, Anglicans, and later we Methodists also became a protesting schism from our mother, the Anglican Church. Our Methodist roots were a new expression of how to embody the spirituality of Jesus, because we thought that the Anglican hierarchy was financially and spiritually corrupt, and their clergy were way too invested in power and pomp. So, what's the point of this quick history lesson? It's this. Basically, this is not the first time that the church, that Christianity has lost its way. It's not the first time that the church has preferred to power with Mammon and Mars instead of the crucified servant of Yahweh. It's not the first time that the spirituality of Jesus has been rejected and then replaced with a religion about Jesus as a means to power and domination. That's what has changed in churches today. Everything from prayer to Bible studies to fellowship to study groups to worship liturgies is gold towards obtaining power. Power over others, power over the enemy, power to prosper, power to escape suffering and sorrow, power to justify abandoning the last and the least and the lost. The theology that drives much of Christianity is that 7 mountains doctrine. I still got that handout from last week. That's a strategy for creating a totalized Christian culture. And some of this stuff sounds bizarre, like, oh my gosh, Rich has gone off his nut. He really does need vacation. The second part is true. But the first part is, it's bizarre what's happened in Christianity today. The doctrine articulates, and this is kind of cool, this is helpful. The doctrine articulates that there are 7 primary influences in society today. And I think we'd all agree with these. Religion, education, family, government, media, entertainment, and business. Those are the 7 mountains that basically drive culture today. But here's what's changed. The purpose of the church is no longer to role model the spirituality of Jesus. Rather, it's to engage and influence and infiltrate and dominate each of these spheres of influence. For example, moral issues like abortion or homosexuality are seen by the 7 Mountain Doctrine as a threat, an attack on Christianity and its view of the family. It's no longer acceptable to instruct one's church against abortion or homosexuality. Kind of like in the old days, here's an old stereotype, when Christians were instructed not to drink or dance or play cards. That's good Methodist history there. But that instruction was not political. It was about the discipling of your character within your Christian life. What's changed is the church is now actively, intentionally, strategically training up its people to impose its thou shalt nots on the totality of society. Prayer isn't just prayer anymore. To keep the tribe pure, we must keep the nation pure. Abortion and homosexuality, for example, cannot be tolerated anywhere, nor can those who tolerate such be tolerated. There's a purification process that is driving Christian proclamation that you hear in the media over and over on TV today. Education must be indoctrination into a particular pedagogy. Methods that require critical thinking and cultural context and scientific rigor and evolutionary assumptions must submit to a pre-knowledge that is rooted in a biblical worldview that is static, not living. Think of I'll come back to this in a few weeks, but think of what's going on in the courts with originalism. What that comes down to is that the Constitution is a dead document. It is a static document. It is not a living document. And so you must interpret it in its literal and original form. Well, this happens in the churches as well. In other words, the educational journey of discovery and creativity is transformed into a shaping process of obedience and conformity to dogma. Entertainment can no longer be autonomous, just exploring boundaries. It must become a modifier of behavior, a shaper of correct ideology. The Disney blow-up is a case in point. Disney's aspiration to portray queer folk positively, to lift up diverse ethnicities in its movies, in its presentations, in its businesses. Its commitment to promote a more accurate history as the backstories to all those cartoons we love. These are understood as threats to the Christian way of life, because the Christian way of life is rooted in a set hierarchical order of God, man, literally, family, clan, etc. In other words, the Enlightenment secular embrace of a pluralist society is itself an attack on the Christian way of life and cannot be tolerated. I'm going to say that one sentence again because we need to understand this. If we're to even begin to understand that politics is not a pendulum swing. This is not business as usual anymore. The Enlightenment secular embrace of a pluralist society is an attack on the Christian way of life and cannot be tolerated. This reactionary turn isn't necessarily new in Christianity. Paul himself was a liberalizer of tradition. His churches were seen as threats to the integrity of the newly emerging Jewish Jesus movement. The issues between Jewish Christ followers and Gentile Christ followers were never resolved. But neither faction had access to governing powers. The difference today is that the church, in partnership with oligarchs, has access and is creating a determination to reimpose a hierarchical order rooted in moralized law. Notions of compassionate doing for others are not the emphasis. I'm not saying it's not there, that's just not the emphasis anymore. Today, the woman caught in adultery should be stoned for the sake of family values. Notions of economic justice for people, generational poverty, who are just embedded in poverty, are not on the agenda. What is on the agenda is to eradicate the state from redistributing wealth from the top to the bottom. Libertarian economics, rather than the Jubilee, is driving Christian thinking. I'm talking about what's coming out of the church. And yes, it has political implications. But this is church thinking. Families of diversity are beginning to be thought of as unclean and suspect, a perversion of what God intends, and so forth. We are not talking about a little sect or a little cult or this or that. We're talking multiple millions of people who are embodying this Christian nationalist way of life. And a good 40% or more of the American people are welcoming of these ideologies. Christians, I think, are, in biblical terms, are becoming foot soldiers for Pharaoh, who once again to enslave the masses so that the oligarchs can live in the stratosphere and others will make bricks without straw. Christians have become useful idiots in the great cultural deception that turns the spirituality of Jesus into a crusade of each against all. Jonah, the prophet that Jesus spoke of in today's text, was a reluctant prophet. He refused God's command to go to the Ninevites to preach repentance. He refused to go to the enemy. Jonah was angry with God because he knew that Yahweh would have compassion and mercy on the Ninevites. And the Ninevites were basically the Nazis of Hebrew Scripture. They were not a nice people. Jonah didn't want to make peace with his enemy. He didn't want to see Yahweh love the unlovable. Jonah wanted their destruction and annihilation. He did not want to do unto others. He did not want to bring liberation or release or sight or the good news of the Jubilee. The sign of Jonah, the reluctant prophet, is at least this. And you might notice that Jesus didn't say what the sign was. He just said, that's the sign that's going to be given to you. So this is speculation. But the sign of Jonah, the reluctant prophet, is at least this: the Spirit of God, the love of God, the compassion of God will find a way to end the violence, to dispel the confusion, to tear down the walls of hostility that our fears erect to keep us separated from each other. The sign of Jonah is at least this: grace is greater than sin. And no matter how discouraged we are, no matter how bewildered we are, no matter how arrogant we are, God will find a way to bring resurrection from crucifixion and life from death. This is the sign from heaven, not to do to them what they would do to us. This is the sign from heaven: do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. We might not be able to resolve our frustration with fellow believers, but we can be a witness to what we have come to believe. We can do for others what we would want them to do for us. We can offer our time and talent and treasure to bring good news to the poor, sight to the blind, freedom to the captive, liberation for the oppressed, a jubilee for creation and creatures. We can be Christ's body. We can be compassion. And we can trust that God will lead us through this valley. A new creation will rise from what is passing away. The point being, at the very heart of our struggles in the church is the identity of who it is we think Jesus is. And when we are speaking with fellow believers, I just want to keep reminding us, the content of his message is not a mystery. Stick to that, and you will be able to discern good from evil. It's a wonderful hymn that we will sing, and it goes to, from the starts in the inside and